Well, it's wonderful to be here, and after following sunshine, it's a hard act to try to duplicate, so I'll do my best. As it turns out, for those of you who care about these things, and I do, next Monday I'm going to be at Duke, and so I'm at Michigan State today. Had I only been a little more perceptive or predictive, I might have tried to squeeze in Kentucky and Wisconsin, but it's not to be. In the last presentation, the emphasis was on communicating more effectively, in a sense, the benefits of mitigation, that is, the benefits of addressing environmental problems by communicating science more effectively. And I think that's absolutely important. I also think it's important that we emphasize or communicate or understand the distribution of those benefits, because not all parties will benefit equally. Okay? It may seem odd that something like climate change could have differential benefits across the planet, but they are likely to. Secondly, since I'm an economist, there are costs of addressing problems. And frankly, if there weren't costs, we wouldn't have them, okay? These costs also are not distributed equally across all parties who have to make adjustments. So we need to understand not only the aggregate benefits of mitigation, but how those benefits are distributed across parties that have to take action, how costly it is to them. We have to understand the costs in the aggregate of taking action, and then how those costs are distributed across parties that have to do so. Now, why is that important? Because that addresses or is underlying this problem of collective action that I'm interested in. Collective action is just what it sounds like. It's taking action to address a problem, and we often observe across a variety of environmental and natural resource problems a huge difference in the timing and the completeness in which we address the issue. Sometimes groups respond quickly. The problem, in fact, is addressed so rapidly we hardly ever knew it existed. In other cases, it's a lot more frustrating. It's slow, it's incomplete, some parties hold out. Well, that's what I'm interested in, is this array of differential responses to environmental and natural resource problems, and trying to understand this variance and what factors contribute to that variance, and why that's useful in a symposium like this to try to move us forward, is it helps you address where the glitches are likely to be. What do you have to do to move things forward? How can you better understand why some parties might be resistant, okay? And I'm not really referring to denial or things like that, but more where a party might actually think they bear more costs than benefits. In a moment, I'm going to turn to this in more depth, but I think, there's a large body of research. Tom Dietz has been part of that research in terms of collective action, when it's successful and when it's not. And one sort of common underlying factor in terms of successful collective action is a proportionate distribution of benefits and costs. And what I mean by that is that parties that have to bear costs to take action expect to capture benefits that are commensurate. If they expect to bear more costs than benefits, then it's understandable they might be reluctant to take action. If they expect to gain more benefits than costs, then they're naturally more likely to be advocates. But these distributional problems set up a need to come up with some kind of compensation, whether it's monetary or other kinds of transfer activities to sort of bridge these gaps. Now, sometimes that just doesn't happen. And then other exogenous factors, or endogenous in some cases, have to take place, like a crisis that actually narrow differences where more parties see benefits from taking action, and costs become less and less of an issue. And so I'll come to these points as I go through my talk. I teach a class in our environmental economics core curriculum on collective action, And the students are required to read the literature and then to address empirical problems, in some cases that there's literature on, in some cases that there's not, to try to understand why some of them seem so resistant to effective action. So that's kind of where I'm going to lay things out, and then towards the end, I will come back with some ways to move forward. So these are, of course, common examples of externalities. And an externality is when parties, at least in economics, the way we think about these things, is when parties take actions where they don't fully consider all the social costs involved. So they consider their private costs, but they don't consider the social costs, so that leads to too many emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, or other pollutants into the atmosphere. Too much overfishing, because the overall effects on the stock are not considered by individual fishers. In this wonderful picture from the 1920s of Long Beach, where you have all of these oil wells. What were they doing? Did they need that to extract the oil for geological reasons? No. These were town lot oil wells that were put on each lot in order to extract oil as fast as possible, in order to not only get as much oil, but to drain their neighbors, okay? So this is a collective action problem, because it actually led to the premature depletion of that oil reservoir. But this is exactly the kind of thing that happens in general with aquifers and other common resources. So these are three cartoons or pictures of this general problem of a lot of waste that we would all be we'd be benefited if we could find some way to resolve these problems. So as I said, externalities occur when parties do not bear the full cost of their actions, and so they do too much, okay? And we often, at least in economics, refer to these sorts of problems arising from open resources. That is, resources that do not constrain entry, there are no clear property rights, or other ways to instill or have parties consider the costs and benefits of their actions. And so standard problems appear, and unfortunately, stick around for a long time. So we get depleted fisheries, I'll come back to that. Oil pools, I'm going to come back to that. Aquifers, I'll show you a great cartoon on that one. In California, of course, we're in the midst of another continuing drought. Our aquifers are being dramatically depleted, but they've been being depleted for a long time. But here's where a crisis, I think, is going to be beneficial. Too rapid harvesting or deforestation, greenhouse gas emissions, and so forth. So as I mentioned, addressing these problems seems self-evidently beneficial. But some parties have to bear costs. Some, in cases of overfishing, some vessels have to be retired. Some fishers have to stop fishing. Some communities can no longer support fishing. In fact, some fishing countries might not be able to fish at the same level as in the past. They're not necessarily going to be happy about dealing with those costs unless they can see some kind of commensurate benefits. Now, if the science isn't so uncertain about this and it's expected that the stock will rebound relatively quickly, then I think you can see a movement towards action. But if it's unknown whether the stock will rebound quickly or if it's likely to rebound someplace else, it sets up this distributional conflict. And so parties become reluctant to cut back their fishing effort because they're unsure whether or not they're going to benefit from this action. So these distributional conflicts appear over and over and over, at least in all of the collective action problems that I'm familiar with. As a consequence, as I mentioned, a lot of problems just don't go away. I think any reasonable person would be stunned or frustrated by seeing numerous articles in Nature or Science about the continuing depletion of highly migratory wild ocean fisheries. And these articles go back at least to the 1980s and 1970s, and we're still overfishing them. And I'm going to come back to that. But see, it's an example of a problem that seems clear, and yet nothing concrete, at least in some cases, seems to happen. And so why is that? The way in which I think about these problems is transactions costs. And really, I think of a collective action problem really as one of bargaining. That is, parties engage in some kind of contractual process to cut back on deforestation, cut back on fishing, cut back on groundwater depletion, cut back on greenhouse gas emissions. In return, they get some benefits. So it's a bargaining setting, and if this sounds very economic to you, well, of course, I'm an economist, and that's the way I think about things. But I think it's a useful way to think about this process. These collective action bargaining problems are quite successful. The transactions costs are relatively lower, narrower, more local environmental problems, and then they grow exponentially, of course, as we deal with more far-ranging environmental problems, resource problems, and especially those at the global level. And so this is, to repeat, the fundamental issue. The way I see it is, how can you resolve these distributional problems? So they hinge on first getting a sense of the aggregate benefits and costs, how those are distributed among the various populations that have to take action, and what kinds of ways can be developed, institutional ways or others, to bring the distribution of costs and benefits into balance so that we can march forward to deal with the problem. There are four major factors, I think, that make this hard. And Sunshine mentioned a key one, and that is uncertainty. For some environmental problems or resource problems, the uncertainty is not so significant. That is, we have an understanding of the issue, the natural system. We have a pretty clear understanding of the distribution of the problem. And as a consequence, taking action doesn't lead to so many unknowns as to how the natural system is going to respond, what the costs are that the parties will have to engage in, what the nature of the technologies, and so forth, okay? And in those cases, we tend to see action, okay? But it's where the uncertainty is the greatest. It's hard for parties to better understand the distribution of benefits and costs. They don't really know the aggregate, and in the case of greenhouse gas emission controls, which I'll come back to, there's more and more consensus about the aggregate effects, but there's still a great deal of uncertainty about the regional impacts. And the regional impacts are really important because that affects the local people and their political representatives. And so it's that kind of uncertainty about the benefits, their distribution, and the costs and their distribution that is a very important contributor to this collective action problem. Then there are varying preferences to deal with the problem as well as to bear costs. For small resources, this isn't so much of an issue. We're more or less all in the same part of the resource. We see it, we understand it, so we can observe its response or lack of response from taking action. For large ones, that's not so much the case, okay? And so if we're on part of a fishery, a global fishery where the stock is vibrant, and we're doing well by harvesting it, we might not see the problem, and we might not have much motivation to engage in action. Sunshine mentioned the case of pollution, nitrate pollution in the Gulf of Mexico. If I'm a farmer up in the Mississippi Basin, I don't really see the problem. I might hear about it in the Gulf of Mexico. It doesn't affect me directly. But my farming activities, my use of nitrate fertilizers and various farming practices actually do affect me. And I might have different sense of the seriousness of the problem or my willingness to partake in it. A key factor in these differential preferences is one that we often hear about, the north-south or rich-poor divide. And that's a real one, okay? Because not only do rich societies have a better sense or a better wherewithal or ability to address problems, but they have different expectations about doing so, or different values for doing so. Poor societies where populations are struggling and they want to do better in the future, some environmental problem might be of lower importance to them. And this just isn't across countries, it's within countries. We already know that there are huge income and wealth disparities within the United States. Similarly, there are huge important wealth and income distributional differences in China, in Europe, and so forth. And so it's even within countries that different populations will have different preferences. Other things may be important to them, okay? And so if a policy is costly, you have to find ways to bring people on board, and oftentimes it'll involve some kind of compensation, and understanding that is helpful in moving forward. The last two, this one is clearly related, differences in information. And this has to do, importantly, especially the larger the resource, as I mentioned before, if you're on one part of the resource where things look good and another part where things look bad, you just have a different view of it. But moreover, the resource or the natural system might respond differently across spatial patterns. And so I might not see any response. And down here, they're seeing a response. And I might say, hey, I'm bearing costs, but nothing good's happening. I don't know if I want to continue, okay? Another really important one is compliance. Cheating undermines any collective action. And so that's why it's important to align benefits and costs so all parties, in a sense, have incentive to adhere to contracts, to adhere to agreements, because cheating just causes these things to unravel. So how can we incorporate these four factors in some concrete examples? And fortunately, we have lots of intellectual firepower to draw upon. Ronald Coase won the Nobel Prize in 1991, and his emphasis was really on contracting or bargaining across these kind of problems, and this whole notion of transactions cost, where it is too costly, how you might go about lowering these costs to bring agreement. And of course, everyone, or most of you in this room, know Lynn Ostrom, whose work on more local common pool problems gave us great insights on many of the factors that lead to successful collective action in those settings. Okay, and I'll come back to those in a moment. And then Oliver Williamson, who was the co-winner at that time, who I actually did my dissertation under, Ollie has been concerned with how these transactions costs frame the kinds of institutions we need in order to, in a sense, internalize benefits and costs to align these things to take action. So let's look at get a sense of the factors involved, and then look at some examples. In the case of these local common pool resource, that means open access resource problems studied by Elinor Ostrom and her teams, we often see success there. Now, there is a problem with the selection bias in the sense that that data set, which there are a number of these data sets are being assembled at Arizona State and at Indiana as well, we don't see the failures because they don't pop up in these sort of case studies. And so it's somewhat of a truncated sample. But nevertheless, we do see solutions to many of these problems, and we can get at these four factors. First of all, as I mentioned before, there's far less uncertainty. These are local users, they know the resource, they know the problem, and they have a good sense of how the resource or the natural system is likely to respond. They have similar preferences. These are people who communicate, they trust one another, they have similar preferences. So it's easier to align their incentives and their interests in taking action. These distributional problems are not so severe. They have similar information because the resource tends to be smaller, bounded, and they all understand it, and so they don't have these differential views of things. And then compliance. They monitor one another. their strict rules, their local norms of action and so forth to help keep everybody on board to address the issue. And these kinds of smaller natural resource environmental problems are actually the ones I'm going to come back to at the end, because even though it's not mutually exclusive, you can still be concerned about climate change, but I still think you can take direct action to deal with some more smaller scale problems, and I want to come back to those in a moment. Now with larger scale ones, and I don't mean global totally, but everything in between, local artisanal fisheries and these large global ones, there's a whole range of problems. And here the record is far more mixed, and here's where we oftentimes have longitudinal data, so we can look at efforts to address a problem, when they broke down, when they came back, and so forth. And so many of these I've looked at, but there's just a giant literature out there that's very helpful. So we get, as I mentioned before, competitive extraction of oil pools, which is like aquifers, fisheries, and so forth. And for many of these, it just is stunning how slow we seem to be responding in some cases. And here is an example that I think is quite informative, because it involves, it's the US, it's all within one country. In fact, it's all within one state. It's in Alaska. It's Prudhoe Bay. It was the largest oil field discovered in North America. The wonderful and crazy thing about oil and natural gas is they migrate. So if you put a well in here, you can actually suck up oil and natural gas from elsewhere in the formation. So you can take your neighbors, and you already saw that. Well, Prudhoe Bay was discovered in 1968. There was competitive, surprisingly, but competitive extraction on that field for 31 years. It levied billions of dollars in waste. And people were understanding this. The state of Alaska was understanding this, but we couldn't get a real resolution. In 1988, the field went into decline, not primarily because of the running out of the hydrocarbons in that formation, but the fact that by this competitive extraction, they had so, in a sense, wrecked the formation in terms of a uniform production pattern that the field was importantly damaged. And we didn't really get a resolution until the field was finally completely purchased in 1999. Another quick example has to do with fisheries. These are the iconic examples of an open access resource. Even relatively inshore fisheries are overexploited. And we've been grappling with this problem since the 1950s with all sorts of restricted entry, licensing schemes, constraints on equipment and what have you, and stocks still fall. And more recently, there has been this introduction of cap and trade and shares in the cap. And these are referred to as catch shares, and some colleagues of mine, in fact, Chris Costello and my dean at the Bren School had an article in Science about the effectiveness, using a large data set that they had, of these catch shares in terms of halting the decline in stocks. By changing incentives, fishers become, in a sense, an owner of the right to fish, and that value is only maintained if they, in fact, protect the fishery. And so it changes incentives. Not all parties benefit, though. Some people lose out, and processors often lose out. So as a consequence, despite the benefits demonstrated in that Science article, only, depending on how you measure, between 2 and 5% of world fisheries in terms of annual harvest have these kind of catch share arrangements. And in the US, we're kind of slowly moving towards them, but it's a very slow and complicated process. And aquifers, of course, they're a notorious open access resource. And I have this wonderful chart here. You might not believe this, but if you drive across parts of the Central Valley of California, or in fact Silicon Valley, as you can see here, the subsidence from overdraft is just incredible. And so you can drive along, and then the highway or the road just drops down and then moves along and then goes back up, and that's because of subsidence from the collapse of the structure due to overdraft. We've been worrying about excessive extraction of groundwater for a long time, and it's become increasingly critical as an alternative source of water as surface water levels have fallen due to the drought. But until this year, California's aquifers were essentially open access. That is, wells were not metered generally. Anybody who put a well could extract water. If that isn't a crazy system, I don't know what is, but with the drought and finally the state passing legislation, it's empowering or really requiring local groundwater management districts to more effectively put in place some collective action regimes. So here's a case where a crisis, the drought, has narrowed differences and forced some movement on this, and I'll come back to that. I will just briefly come back to problems, because some of these you're quite aware of and another maybe less so. Of course, frustrating on greenhouse gas emission controls, but also these very valuable, highly migratory fish species. This is an area that I work in more. Tunas are incredibly valuable. The annual ceremonial auction of the first bluefin tuna brought to Tokyo in January, the fish goes for $1 million or more. It gives you an idea of just how valuable it is to be in that fishery. And the Atlantic bluefin tuna is one of the most imperiled, even though we've had a cooperative management regime since the 1960s, the ICCAT. You can see here just the huge range of the fishery, and yet those stocks have been dropping generally since the 1970s and in some cases since the 1980s. And so we've been worried about it. And some established fishing nations, Spain, Italy, and US and Canada to some degree, have actually cut back on fleets. The problem is, and so that involves buying back vessels and buying off local politicians in a variety of ways and so forth to get them to bear these costs. The problem is there have been new entrants, because you can see the range of the fishery and the open nature of the ocean. And so Chinese fishing, Tunisian, Turkish fleets, and so forth have tended to come in and replace the ones that have been withdrawn from established fishing nations. Well, what does that do to a collective action bargaining problem? You go to fishers in Spain and say, we want you to cut back to save the stock, and their response is, hey, the Algerians will take those fish. And so it reduces their incentive to bargain, to agree. And so these give you some data that I compiled, and you can see just the change in the share of the harvest, this for bluefin tuna and the ICCAT, between 1980 and 2008. And so for developed countries, the established fishing countries, their share of the harvest has dropped just at the same time. Almost perfect replacement has taken place from developing countries. And they want to grow their fisheries. They have a lot of poor people. It's a new industry. It's understandable. But you see, it just doesn't work very well for conserving the stock. And so that's this distribution of benefits and cost notion. And of course, greenhouse gas emission controls are very frustrating, and not only getting them unilaterally, but getting international coordination. Here is a graph that I assembled. It's just really to illustrate. It's not predictive or anything, but what you can see, the dark background are emissions that have been generally flat from developed countries, the US, EU, and so forth. And then the lighter gray emissions gradually rising, as we all know, from developing countries, India, China, Brazil, Indonesia, and so forth. And then the one diagonal line that's rising over time is just the cumulative number of annual conference of parties meetings about the problem. All I wanted to show here was we've been meeting on this problem over and over and over, and yet emissions continue to rise, okay? And so there are some fundamental questions. Well, why is that? And these international problems, as I said, are especially hard, as you all know, because you're involving sovereign countries. And so sovereign leaders of sovereign countries have to respond to local constituencies. These are not homogeneous. Some think they might bear more costs from mitigation, others think they'll benefit more. So it involves an internal political problem, and moreover, it involves one across countries. And so countries' leaders have to agree. And they can't just agree at one time, since these are sovereign countries after all. You want these things to be incentive compatible, that is, durable. Because down the line, if a big country decides, hey, this is too costly, there's not very much you can frankly do, okay? These distributional issues have to be addressed. And the numbers in the case of greenhouse, there's so much uncertainty, it's hard to get a good handle on this. But the numbers are huge. Just transfers from the US to Chinese consumers alone have been estimated to be in the trillions of dollars if energy costs go up sufficiently so that Chinese consumers, especially in the western part of China where people are poor and really have expectations of getting wealthier and having a better life, have to be compensated for cutting back on their consumption patterns, okay? Now, these numbers are just to illustrate, and they're not ones I put together, but they demonstrate the flows that may be required to make these things long-term and durable in order to achieve what we want. As I put down here, country leaders, despite what they say, essentially cooperate when it serves important constituencies to do so, at least over the long term. Now, what this means is then there's sort of a paradox, unfortunately, that a crisis can actually help bring parties together. Now, why might that be? Well, because a crisis with the resource actually reduces some uncertainty. Parties can better see the benefits and costs and their distribution. And so it narrows perceptions, it narrows informational differences, and it can raise country-level benefits from agreeing and complying. Now, this suggests that preemptive actions might not be that common, and that, unfortunately, we might have to wait till a crisis. But nevertheless, this is what our experience suggests could be the case. In a global case, that these bring more information about costs and benefits and their distribution, and on a smaller scale, I think these crises often trigger action, as I mentioned. In fact, how might we go forward? Because as I said, this is pretty gloomy, at least the last few things I said. But that doesn't mean that there aren't any ways that we can have important impacts on the fate of the Earth in addressing environmental problems. In terms of the global, as Sunshine mentioned, much more information and communication, not only about aggregate benefits, but aggregate costs and their distribution is really important. And I think it needs to be I understand the idea of advocacy, but there is a downside to advocacy if your information or the knowledge that you're presenting is viewed not as neutral. And so you really want it to be neutral so parties can view it as credible. And there will be legitimate differences in views based on these costs and benefits. Smaller scale problems, I think, are the ones we can really move forward on. They're better understood. We can generally get greater consensus. Distributional issues can be resolved. And so let me give you some examples and then close. Because after all, I'm from the West. Not everybody can go to Michigan State, so I went to the University of Montana, so it's an M anyway. Many of my students and graduates of the Bren School work to maintain stream flows. With the drought, stream levels are dropping, water temperature rising, fisheries and habitat are becoming imperiled. And so there are organizations, some cases nonprofits like the Freshwater Trust, sometimes profits like Westwater Research, go out and negotiate with irrigators to leave water in the stream late in the season. And this is happening all over the West, and it's having important and visible and profound benefits. Habitat credits, okay? So this is how you get people lined up to protect habitat, okay? And we might think of these nutrients and water quality trading to do this. To help meet Endangered Species Act objectives, as well as preserving habitat and open space around many communities. Groundwater, as I mentioned, is a huge issue. I'm actively working on that now, and others here are as well. With the drought and with the collapse of many aquifers or the drawdown of them, the need to meter, the need to understand where the nature of the aquifer is linked to the surface flows and so forth is becoming more and more critical. And I'm really much more optimistic that more rational and effective management of the groundwater resources in the western U.S. Is on its way. It might not have been 5 years ago, but I think that's an outcome of the drought. So thank you very much.